1945, while Nazi doctors were being tried at Nuremberg, the United States made a secret deal with a man who had killed more people than Josef Mengele. His name was Shiro Ishii. He conducted experiments so horrific that even his own staff had nightmares. He infected entire cities with plague. He dissected living humans without anesthesia. He killed at least 3,000 people in the name of science, and he was never punished. This is the story the world tried to forget. August 1945. Pingfang, Manchuria. A massive complex covering 6 square kilometers was being systematically destroyed from within. Soviet troops were advancing. The war was lost, but the commander of this facility, Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, wasn't worried about defeat. He was worried about evidence. For nearly a decade, this place had been the site of humanity's darkest experiments. Now Ishii ordered his men to burn the buildings, blow up the laboratories, and eliminate all witnesses. Prisoners who had survived the experiments were executed. Documents were incinerated. The entire complex had to disappear. But Ishii made sure to preserve one thing: his research, data, because he knew something his staff didn't. The Americans would want what he had, and they would pay any price for it. To understand how one man could orchestrate such horror, we need to go back to the beginning. Shiro Ishii was born on June 25, 1892, in the Chiyoda village of Shibayama, Japan. Unlike many military leaders who came from poverty, Ishii grew up in wealth and privilege. His family was respected. He had every advantage. He was brilliant. At Kyoto Imperial University, one of Japan's most prestigious institutions, Ishii studied medicine and graduated in 1920. He wasn't just smart, he was ambitious, obsessively ambitious, and he became fascinated with something that would define his entire career: biological warfare. In the 1920s, the world had just survived World War I, where chemical weapons like mustard gas had killed hundreds of thousands. The international community was horrified. In 1925, the Geneva Protocol banned the use of chemical and biological weapons in war. Most nations signed it. Japan signed it. But Ishii saw an opportunity. He believed that if everyone agreed to ban these weapons, it was because they were incredibly powerful. And if they were that powerful, Japan needed them. In 1928, Ishii was sent on a 2-year tour of Western countries to study bacteriology. He visited over 30 universities and research facilities in the United States, Canada, and Europe. Officially, he was learning about medicine. Unofficially, he was studying how to weaponize diseases. When he returned to Japan in 1930, Ishii had a plan. He convinced the Japanese military leadership that biological weapons could give them a decisive advantage. Unlike conventional weapons, biological agents were cheap to produce, impossible to defend against, and could devastate enemy populations without destroying infrastructure. The military was intrigued. Ishii was persuasive, well-connected, and absolutely certain of himself. In 1932, they gave him permission to begin research. They gave him funding, they gave him staff, and they gave him something else: permission to experiment on human subjects. At first, the facility was small, located in Zhangma Fortress in Manchuria, which Japan had occupied, but Ishii's ambitions quickly outgrew the space. In 1936, construction began on a massive new complex in Pingfang, a suburb of Harbin. This wasn't just a laboratory, it was a factory of death. The complex included laboratories, an airport, barracks, administrative buildings, crematoria, and a prison where human subjects were held. It had its own power plant, water supply, and railway connection. Over 3,000 people worked there, including doctors, scientists, technicians, and soldiers. The facility was officially called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. Its real name was Unit 731. Ishii was in complete control. Unit 731 was designed with one purpose: to turn disease into a weapon. But to do that, Ishii needed test subjects. He needed to know exactly how much of a pathogen would kill a human, how quickly, which delivery methods were most effective, and he needed to test these things not on animals, but on people. The Japanese military provided him with prisoners. These weren't just war criminals or soldiers. They were civilians, men, women, and children. Chinese, Russian, Mongolian, Korean, anyone the Japanese considered an enemy. They were arrested on vague charges: espionage, resistance, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were brought to Unit 731 in railway cars, packed together, with no idea where they were going. When they arrived, they were given a number and a new identity. They were no longer human beings. They were called Maruta. Maruta is a Japanese word meaning log or wooden log. It was code. If anyone asked what Unit 731 was doing, the staff would say they were processing lumber. The prisoners were lumber. Raw materials, expendable. The complex could hold up to 600 prisoners at once. They were kept in cells in the central prison block, known as the row block. The conditions were deliberately harsh, cold, cramped, just enough food to keep them alive, because Ishii wanted healthy test subjects. Sick prisoners wouldn't provide reliable data. The doctors and scientists who worked at Unit 731 were some of Japan's best and brightest. Many had graduated from top universities. They were respected professionals with families, with normal lives outside the facility. But inside, they performed experiments that defy comprehension. And they justified it with science. They told themselves they were advancing medical knowledge, that the sacrifice of a few would save many, that these weren't really people. They were criminals, enemies of the state. Ishii created a culture where cruelty was normalized, where empathy was weakness, where questioning orders was unthinkable. And in that environment, ordinary men became monsters. What happened inside Unit 731 was systematic torture, disguised as research. Let me be clear, these weren't medical experiments in any ethical sense. They were atrocities. But to understand the full scope of Ishii's crimes, you need to know what was done. One of the most infamous series of experiments involved frostbite. Ishii wanted to know how to treat Japanese soldiers fighting in the freezing winters of Manchuria. So, prisoners were taken outside in sub-zero temperatures. Their arms or legs would be exposed to temperatures as low as -40 degrees Celsius. Water would be poured over their limbs until they froze solid. Then researchers would test different methods of thawing. Hot water, gradual warming, nothing. They took detailed notes on tissue damage, gangrene, and amputation survival rates. The prisoners' screams were described in clinical terms as responses to stimuli. But frostbite was just one category. Ishii's team conducted pressure experiments, placing prisoners in chambers where air pressure was increased or decreased until their eyes popped from their sockets or their organs ruptured. They wanted to know human tolerance limits. They conducted dehydration experiments, denying prisoners water for days or weeks, measuring exactly when organ failure occurred. They performed tests with electricity, with poison gas, with fire. And then there was Viva. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Unit 731. Vivisection is dissection of a living organism. Ishii's doctors performed surgeries on fully conscious prisoners without anesthesia, not because anesthesia wasn't available, but because they wanted to observe the body's natural responses. They removed organs to see how long a person could survive without them. They performed amputations, not for medical reasons, but to practice surgical techniques. They infected prisoners with diseases and then cut them open to observe the pathogenous progression in living tissue. Why no anesthesia? The official reason was that anesthesia could affect the data. The real reason was simpler. The prisoners weren't considered human. They were specimens. One survivor testimony described a room called the surgery room where prisoners were strapped to tables. The smell was described as unforgettable, a mixture of disinfectant, blood, and something worse. Doctors worked in shifts. The experiments never stopped. Ishii personally observed many of these procedures. He didn't just order them, he watched. He took notes. He pushed his staff to be more thorough, more detailed, more extreme. He believed he was building the future of warfare. But the experiments on individual prisoners were just the beginning. Ishii's ultimate goal was to create biological weapons that could be used in warfare. And to test them, he needed a larger scale. Unit 731 developed several pathogens as weapons, but the most devastating was plague specifically. Bubonic plague carried by fleas. The team bred millions of plague-infected fleas and developed a ceramic bomb that could disperse them over a target area without killing the fleas with the explosion. In 1940, they were ready to test it. Not in a laboratory, on a real city. The city of Ningbo in the Zhejiang province of China became the first target. Japanese planes flew over and dropped ceramic bombs filled with plague-infected fleas. Within weeks, plague broke out. At least 99 people died in the initial outbreak, but the real death toll was likely much higher as the disease spread. In 1941, they struck Chengdi. This time, the outbreak was more severe. Historical records document at least 7,643 cases of plague in the region following the attack. The city descended into chaos. Entire families were wiped out. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. The largest operation came in 1942, during the Zhejiang Sea Campaign. Ishii's team deployed plague, cholera, typhoid, and other diseases across multiple cities and villages. The Chinese government estimated that over 250,000 civilians died as a direct result of these biological attacks. Let that number sink in. 250,000 people, not soldiers. Civilians, farmers, shopkeepers, children, elderly, dead from diseases deliberately released on them. And Unit 731 documented everything. They sent teams to affected areas to photograph the victims, collect samples, and assess the effectiveness of their weapons. They treated human suffering like a science project, because to them, it was. Ishii considered these operations a success. He had proven that biological weapons could devastate a population at a fraction of the cost of conventional warfare. He began developing even more ambitious plans targeting American cities and other diseases. The war ended before he could execute them, but he was ready. Behind every number was a person, a life, a family destroyed. The victims of Unit 731 weren't abstractions in a report. They were human beings. One survivor testimony describes a young Chinese woman, pregnant, who was brought to Unit 731. She was infected with syphilis and subjected to vivisection while fully conscious. The doctors wanted to observe the effect of the disease on both the mother and the unborn child. She died on the operating table. Her screams haunted the soldier who witnessed it for the rest of his life. Another account tells of a Russian man who survived 3 years as a prisoner. He was subjected to repeated experiments, frostbite, starvation, disease injection. Somehow, he survived. Each one, not because he was strong, but because the doctors wanted to see how much a human body could endure before finally breaking. He weighed less than 80 pounds when Soviet troops liberated the area. Children as young as 3 years old were used as test subjects. They were infected with diseases and left to die, so researchers could study the progression in developing bodies. Some were killed simply because they witnessed something they shouldn't have. One of the few survivors who later testified said the worst part wasn't the physical pain. It was the complete dehumanization. The doctors never spoke to prisoners except to give commands. They never used names, only numbers. They discussed the prisoners' bodies as if they weren't there. This Maruta is responding well to the pathogen. That Maruta's organs are ideal for harvesting. And the staff became numb to it. In their minds, they were scientists doing important work. The suffering wasn't real to them anymore. It was data, results, progress. One doctor who worked at Unit 731 later said in an interview, conducted decades after the war, that he didn't feel guilty. He said he was following orders, that it was wartime, that the prisoners would have died anyway, that his research saved Japanese lives. He was never punished for his crimes. None of them were. August 15th, 1945. Japan surrendered. The war was over. Shiro Ishii immediately went into action. He ordered the destruction of Unit 731. Buildings were blown up. Equipment was buried. Prisoners who hadn't already died in experiments were executed to eliminate witnesses. The remaining staff was sent home with strict orders. Never speak of what happened. Ishii himself went into hiding, spreading rumors that he had died. For several months, American occupation forces believed he was dead, but he wasn't. In reality, Ishii was waiting. He knew the Americans would eventually find out about Unit 731, and he knew they would want his data. Was right. In 1946, American military investigators discovered evidence of biological warfare research in occupied Manchuria. They began searching for the scientists involved. When they learned Ishii was alive, they made contact. What happened next was one of the most controversial decisions of the post-war period. The Americans made Ishii an offer. Give us your research data, and we'll grant you immunity from war crimes prosecution. Why would they do this? The Cold War was beginning. The Soviet Union was America's new enemy, and they knew the Soviets were also searching for Unit 731 data. The Americans wanted to get there first. Ishii had conducted experiments that no Western scientist could ever legally perform. He had data on human responses to disease, 2 chemical weapons, 2 biological agents data that couldn't be obtained any other way. From a purely strategic standpoint, that data was invaluable. Lieutenant General Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Japan, authorized the deal. Ishii and the other Unit 731 scientists would provide full disclosure of their research. In exchange, they would receive immunity, and their names would be kept out of the Tokyo war crimes trials. The deal was classified top secret. Even the other Allied nations, Britain, China, the Soviet Union, weren't fully informed. The American government justified it as a matter of national security. In 1947, Ishii handed over thousands of pages of research, including detailed reports on human experiments, biological weapon effectiveness, and mass casualty data. The Americans took it all. They studied it. They incorporated it into their own biological warfare program at Fort Detrick in Maryland, and they kept their end of the bargain. Ishii walked free. Shiro Ishii spent the rest of his life in Japan, a free man. He never faced trial. He was never imprisoned. He never publicly admitted to any wrongdoing. After the war, he returned to private life. He opened a medical clinic. He became a consultant. He gave lectures at medical conferences. People knew who he was, what he had done, but they said nothing. It was an open secret. In the late 1940s and 1950s, Ishii occasionally met with American military. He provided additional information, consulted on biological warfare programs, and even trained American scientists in techniques developed at Unit 731. Meanwhile, the other members of Unit 731 also went unpunished. Many returned to prominent positions in Japanese society. Some became professors at major universities. Others joined pharmaceutical companies. One became the president of the Japan Medical Association. The Japanese government never officially acknowledged Unit 731's crimes. To this day, there is no official apology, no memorial, no recognition. Japanese textbooks rarely mention it. When they do, it's in vague terms: wartime research or controversial medical experiments. China and Korea have repeatedly demanded acknowledgement and reparations. The Japanese government has responded that all war reparations were settled in the San Francisco Peace Treaty. The victims and their descendants have received nothing. Ishii died on October 9th. He was 67 years old. He died in his bed, surrounded by family. His funeral was attended by friends and colleagues. He was cremated, and his ashes were interred at a Buddhist temple. His last words, according to family members, were about his research. Even at the end, he believed he had done important work. He never expressed remorse. Compare this to Nuremberg, where Nazi doctors were tried, convicted, and executed for crimes that, while horrific, were in some cases less extensive than what Ishii had done. Josef Mengele, the angel of death of Auschwitz, became the world's most hunted fugitive. Ishii gave lectures at medical conferences. The difference was politics. The Americans wanted Ishii's data more than they wanted justice, and so justice was denied. The story of Shiro Ishii forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Justice is not always served. Sometimes, the guilty go free because it's convenient, because their knowledge is valuable, because politics matters more than morality. Ishii's crimes were not hidden. The American government knew exactly what he had done. They made a conscious choice to protect him because they wanted his research data for the Cold War. They decided that military advantage was worth more than accountability, and that decision had consequences. By granting Ishii immunity, the United States sent a message: if you're useful enough, you can get away with anything. That message echoes through history. The victims of Unit 731 received no justice, no recognition, no compensation. Their suffering was cataloged in reports that helped advance biological warfare programs. Their deaths became footnotes in classified documents. We must remember what happened at Unit 731. Not just because it was horrific, but because it shows what humans are capable of when they abandon empathy. When they dehumanize others, when they justify atrocities in the name of science, or progress, or national security. Ishii believed until his dying day that he was a patriot who served his country. He never saw himself as a monster. That's perhaps the most terrifying part of this story. The worst atrocities in history are often committed by people who believe they're doing the right thing. This was the story of Shiro Ishii, the man who tortured 3,000 people and was never punished. But this is just one part of Unit 731's dark history. In the next video, we'll explore the experiments themselves and detail the frostbite tests that shattered frozen limbs like glass, the pressure chambers that ruptured organs, and the vivisections performed on living, conscious prisoners. If you believe these stories need to be told, hit that like button and subscribe, because the world must never forget what happened at Unit 731.